going to go through ahead of then opening to a Q&A. So please, Amelia.
Hello? Oh, it's on. Great. My name is Amelia Addo and I am the Oil and Gas Sector Manager at Standards Australia. I'm the hydrogen lead also, so my interest here today really is to listen, to learn, but also to contribute to the conversation from a standards perspective, and really understand and also communicate the importance of standards as we go into this hydrogen economy.
My name's Alison Reeve. I'm the task force leader for the development of the National Hydrogen Strategy. So I work with people from all of the states and territories and from the Commonwealth to put together a strategy for Australia to build a hydrogen industry between 2020 and 2030 and deliver that to COAG energy ministers by the end of the year.
Hi.
Testing?
Okay. Hi, I'm Catherine Horlin from BHP. I work in the low emissions technology team, and our team focuses on how BHP can work towards our public target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the second half of this century. We see green hydrogen as a great opportunity to enable us towards that pathway.
Yeah, I'm Russell James. I'm the General Manager of Business Development and Customer Experience at ATCO Gas, and we've heard a little bit about some of the work that we're doing. Part of my team is the innovation team, who's developing the Clean Energy Innovation Hub, which is producing green hydrogen for testing and blending into the gas distribution network. So we think there's a great opportunity in WA for the further development of that sort of technology, including on mine sites.
Perfect. So thanks. Now I'll go through these questions. Obviously, I'll actually let the panelists put their hands together if they want to start answering to one of them, but I'll make sure that if one of you is shy, gets to answer some questions later on. So I think the first idea around the panel is really understanding, obviously with our cross-section of Australian players, from government to Standards Australia and then mining sector and the energy sector, is really understanding what are the key developments in the hydrogen market that somehow motivate the interest, but also what would be then the key likely impacts for the resources sector. Catherine?
I'm happy to start us off. So I think there's a couple of key market developments which have accelerated interest in BHP and probably other companies, which has resulted in this turnout today. A major one is the rapid decrease in renewables cost, and we're also seeing similar cost trajectories for electrolysers. So I think those two combined have a huge impact on the potential reduced costs of levelized hydrogen. And then the other element is when there are announcements like FMG putting significant investment funding in, and the impact then is it makes it a much more viable solution.
I think the other thing I'd add to that too is that the cost of, there's a couple of sort of, I think, a bit of a perfect storm of things that have happened. So as Catherine said, the cost of production has come down because of the cost of renewable energy coming down, the cost of electrolysers coming down. The cost of end use technology has also come down about tenfold in sort of the past 10 to 15 years. So I think that's a big driver as well, is that suddenly, it's a cheap inputs and a cheap end use. The other thing I think is that you have some very large energy users particularly in North Asia, but also other countries as well, who are starting to see hydrogen as something they need to have in their toolbox as they work towards ambitious climate targets that they have. And I think the third thing that has come into it as well is that large companies are really getting involved. So Catherine mentioned Fortescue, and obviously BHP is involved as well. But the very large trading houses in Japan and Korea are getting interested in this. The very big companies in Europe are getting interested in it. And I think a further thing is too that people have realised that hydrogen is something that can be used to decarbonise things that can't be electrified. So I think a lot of the discussion sort of over the last 20 years when people have been focusing on emissions reduction has been focusing on the electricity sector. And now we're suddenly starting to turn our attention to other things and go, well, hang on, there's things we can't electrify, so what do we do about them? What do we do about cement? What do we do about steel? What do we do about long-haul transport where batteries aren't an option? And hydrogen has a role to play in all of those, and so people are sort of seeing it as this incredibly powerful tool, particularly if you are working towards something like having net zero emissions in the second half of the century.
Thank you. The next question is really, well, obviously momentum is behind hydrogen now, but how can the mining sector position itself to benefit from that? For example, we heard from Michael just then that there are some obvious targets, but there is a path to go through to, for example, to access the technologies and to get them to develop to the same grade of safety and maturity that you would require in a mining environment.
Look, I think there's a real opportunity, particularly in Western Australia, to be an early adopter, and we've seen the great renewable sort of fields that we've got in wind and solar, and that really gives a great opportunity for integrated companies such as FMG, or already existing trade route companies such as Woodside that have the opportunity to start export markets. Now, to meet demand ready for Korea and Japan, we have to start now and start to do projects which are building to size and scale. And really, I think that's the momentum that we have an opportunity with within the sector.
I'd agree with you in terms of the early adoption and piloting, trialling. I think the mining sector also has an opportunity to look for investments to strategically try to encourage step change reductions. So what I mean by that is investing in technologies or going into partnerships strategically to try and push that cost curve further down.
I think one of the things about the Australian mining sector is that it's actually incredibly innovative. I work with Dr. Alan Finkel, who's sort of leading the process of the development of the hydrogen strategy, and it's actually a real bugbear of his that the innovation in Australia's mining sector doesn't show up in our international statistics around innovation because it doesn't show up as like new technologies that we export. The way that it shows up is that we export more resources and more commodities. And I think that sort of innovation that we already have in the mining sector actually in Australia actually places it really well to be a leader in adopting things like this.
And just on that as well, considering the areas that the sector are also trying to utilise hydrogen and our experience in the export markets, etc., there are already, I guess, standards and to some extent some regulatory framework in place that the sector can really leverage and position themselves to really be a leader in this space.
Emilia, I was about to call you for the next question, so I think as a perfect segue from this is if you can maybe share what are the latest development and standards both nationally and internationally in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of, from the standards perspective, there are a number of safety standards internationally, but also in countries such as the US, etc., who are quite advanced in the area. And so particularly Australia participates at the International Organisation for Standardisation, which is ISO, and we sort of heard from Michael before how he was using some standards when he was looking at that technology, and that sort of shows that the international space are already thinking and have already charged ahead quite a bit in this space, and so there are standards that already exist, particularly in the safety space, and what's left really is for Australia to look at adopting them. And so we have recently, SANS Australia have recently put together a mirror committee who is mirroring the International Hydrogen Committee at the ISO level, and they have a suite of standards already existing both in the safety, transport, some in the production space that are really ready for adoption and ready for use now. And the opportunity that exists in this space has also caused us to also look beyond what's already existing at that international level, and also caused us to look beyond and look at some of these other countries and what they're also doing with their standards and codes as well, and their regulatory frameworks, to see what's actually needed for us to really advance this hydrogen industry here in Australia.
Thank you, Emilia. The next question is really, and allow me to make a plug about the cocktail function tonight, but what are the opportunities that exist for international collaboration within the mining sector, specific to hydrogen. The plug is really that our CTO Jenny Alley will be presenting on a new international activity to be established within the IEA hydrogen program, but there is existing partnerships, whether at the standards level or within the mining sector, things that and naturally look at hydrogen exactly for what Alison describes. We decarbonize the power sector, then what? And yes, if you want to maybe share some of the initiatives that you're familiar with or involved with, they're already existing.
Yeah, I can cover off on a few things. I suppose at this early stage, collaboration is key. I've heard multiple people say in this early adoption phase, who's going to stick their head right up to the top? Well, no, we need to actually bring multiple partners in to solve some of the challenges for each. So if we're talking about things like mobility, and power generation, even to the point of gas distribution, there's multiple parties that can play a part in size and scale projects that gets that cost curve closer to where it needs to be competitive. I think that's in these early phases really about collaboration in an open forum that helps facilitate larger scale projects and really puts WA at the forefront of that.
Yes, I'd echo that as well. Similar to what Michael said from FMG earlier, collaboration is key. I think that there's a great opportunity for Australia and for the mining sector to help accelerate hydrogen, but I think we can only be successful if we are collaborating and learning together.
I might mention there's a couple of international R&D collaborations that Australia is part of as well, and some of which do relate to mining. So we are part of I think it's 16 country collaboration now through the Mission Innovation Initiative, and that has joined up countries like that you sort of wouldn't think of as usually being partners, but when you think mining, you go, oh yeah, that makes sense. So like Canada is part of that, and Chile is part of it, for example, so both big resource-rich countries. The other one that I'm aware of is there's just recently been a partnership signed between CSIRO and the University of British Columbia in Canada. So for people who don't know Vancouver is kind of the home of fuel cell technologies, and I think has the potential to be a really powerful collaboration because you have two countries that are quite similar in terms of having very large geographical areas, very climatic extremes, being very much based on resources and being outward-looking countries that export, rely on exports and rely on being open economies. So I think that's actually going to be a really interesting one to watch.
Sorry, I was just going to add to that. I think having government support behind it is really key critical. The project that we're doing at Jandakot's supported through ARENA, which helps facilitate that, which also allows knowledge share throughout the industry. And then there's other bodies like Future Fuel, CRCs, to make sure that we're doing work all collaboratively sharing across Australia and the globe to make sure we're not redoing efforts twice. So.
Exactly. There is another kind of initiative which is the Future Energy Exports, CSC, with a very strong hydrogen component. So Eric now, Professor Eric from UWIC, if you want to have some more information, but I think a key buzzword of this type of efforts is actually interoperability. It's just how do you ensure that while we're all trying to develop projects and technologies, we actually develop them in such a way that can be used across the industry. And so I think collaboration is good because it avoids going to blind alleys, because the core technologies are there, but the fueling systems, the fueling protocols. So I think if there is one thing that the hydrogen industry can claim as a big credit, and this is what happens under ISO 26197, is that from the onset is an industry that work on a single standardized protocol for refueling and making sure that we avoid the different plugs and the different things. I think in mining and very heavy application, including marine, trains, I think that's an open book at this point, understanding how to fuel very large users. With that in mind, probably this is one to start actually with Catherine, is what do you see as the near-term opportunities? We've heard from FMG, which is focused on a specific mining vertical. You obviously have a broader view of the industry with all the different mining operations that you have. What do you see the starting points for you? Yeah.
It sounds like an easy question. It's actually challenging. And so I'd probably share from a BHP perspective where we are at really early stages. So as Michael pointed out earlier, there are no trucks available which have fuel cells in them to take hydrogen. I would love to have a truck with a fuel cell that could take hydrogen on a mine site. I'd love that to be my answer, but it's not. So I think really the first steps from a mining industry perspective is actually, as I mentioned before, going into some strategic partnerships to try and invest to accelerate the costs down. So we need the technology to be at a higher technology readiness level and also a much cheaper cost. So I think that investment strategically is a key point, and then also looking at how we can work with the major truck companies or look at other sort of options to try and accelerate that mobility element.
Maybe as a little dovetail and then we'll just open because it's very much linked. What do you see as being the main advantages and disadvantages as being a first to market hydrogen after the mining environment? Catherine, if you maybe want to say.
Yeah. Yes, certainly. So I think the advantage is there is definitely a first mover probably advantage. As Michael pointed out earlier, F&G has had a lot of interest and well done to them for stepping out and being progressive in that way. So there is definitely that first mover advantage, the brand advantage and the opportunity to shape the industry. Probably the disadvantage I'd say is that it's not quite yet at the cost curve requirement, so that means that what you're going to have to invest is a lot more significant in terms of progressing it.
Yeah, I think some of the challenges, particularly into remote locations, is around skill set. So, if you're going to roll something like this out in the Pilbara, then how do you make sure that you've got backup mechanics that can work on fuel cell vehicles, those sorts of things, people that are experienced in hydrogen turbines or blending projects with natural gas. So I think that's some of the challenges with that first stage. Is the state set up for training, or have we got the backup parts and equipment to make sure that operations still run in those remote locations? So that's probably one of the challenges, but really I think setting the forefront and an opportunity. We see blending as an easy stage for blending in with natural gas turbines or other technology on the site that's here and now. Natural gas is very cheap in the state, which is great for all of us, and is lower carbon than the diesel. However, to further decarbonise, it's quite easy, and one of the turbines that we've got down at our site can take 30% today. So that's the test bed that we're putting together to make sure that we can test it up in the Perth metropolitan region so we can roll it out into remote locations.
I guess following on the barriers for cost, skills, availabilities, is there something else? What do you see as being the barriers? I mean, we're talking about introducing a new technology in a time-critical, mission-critical environment, and if you can maybe share some of the thinking around what needs to happen to get there towards, I would say broad-based adoption.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of those is finding the places within a mine site where you can lower the risk of testing it out. This is not just a question of the economics and how the hydrogen stacks up against the diesel. It's the broader economics of, what does it cost to fly someone up from Perth when it breaks down to fix it, and what does it cost you in lost production if this bit breaks down? And it's taking that sort of broader view of not just looking at, here is a diesel unit and we replace it with a hydrogen unit. It's looking at that broader boundary of all of the other costs and all of the other impacts and deciding where's the best place to minimise those risks. It's sort of taking, I guess, more of a risk-based approach to it. Now, having said that, mining sites are actually insanely diverse in terms of the number of bits of kit that you've got around where these things can be tried out. So there are lots of opportunities there. And I think the thing is that what companies learn during that process is not necessarily just about the piece of kit, but it's about the people around it. It's around what new skills do they pick up? How do you have to change your safe work practices? How does it change your duty cycles? All of that sort of stuff is really, really valuable. And in some ways, that's kind of it's almost like an open source type thing. It's something that the more that that side of it is shared, the quicker everybody comes down the learning curve. So yeah, I'd sort of say it's probably not just about looking at the economics, it's looking at the risk-free places to try it out and then thinking about how you perpetuate what you learn around that.
Yes, I'd agree with that. So I think it's critical to, if you're going to be doing any trials as the first element, to be in a non-production critical area. So ancillary equipment like drill rigs or water trucks is a perfect example where you could trial it and be confident that you're not going to impact production. You don't want that call from the asset president. And then the other element is, as you've rightly said, the skills element. That is one of the main questions I've had when I've talked to people internally, is they've said, well, how are we going to maintain this? How do we know how to store it safely? How are we going to transport it? You know, what's the emergency response requirements? There's a lot of those elements to consider.
And I think with a lot of those, there are skills that those skills exist elsewhere in the economy. They just don't exist in the mining sector yet. You know, we've got, you know, we produce a fair bit of hydrogen in this country. The refining sector uses it. People know how to make it, they know how to store it, but those people are all sort of in a completely different silo to the mining sector. So it's also, I think, thinking about how you find those pockets of excellence and pockets of skills and take those skills across to a new sector. A lot of the time you're not necessarily talking about new skills, you're just talking about transferring skills or people whose existing skills get repurposed towards something else.
Just to add to that as well, something that's sort of come up time and time again is this idea of that social license and social acceptance as well around this new economy. It's sort of like, oh, what can we expect? The unknown is there, and this is where, you know, we've already spoken about collaboration. Collaboration is key, knowledge is key, and I think that the work that both the task force are doing, the work that many companies are doing to sort of ensure that people are being brought along the journey and right from the start is really important, particularly with us from a standards perspective. You know, what we've come to realise is that people don't necessarily always check that there's a standard, but they expect that something is being produced or something is being manufactured to a particular standard. And so we have the almost silent role of just making sure that behind the scenes that things are working and things are safe, because that's just what is expected. And so that social licensing is just making sure that safety elements are being considered along the journey, whether we're starting right from now or it's in 20, 30 years' time, that we have the standards in place and the regulatory framework in place to be able to support this industry.
I think social licence too is not just about the community who's around the mine. It's the people who work in the mine. You know, none of us want our workplace to be made more dangerous. So when we talk about social acceptance, it's about worker acceptance. It's about people accepting that their workplace is changing, but that it is staying safe, and that they are, they have access to what they need to stay safe as part of that site.
It's an interesting one as well. You know, we're going to start blend injecting hydrogen into our gas distribution network. So, you know, we train and we develop all the safe work instructions and all the standards for the work on our network. And so, you know, we've got a workforce of a couple of hundred that are all now interested in, okay, what does this mean for me when I'm flow stopping a main out in Mirrabooka or something? I've now got 5% hydrogen. How does that behave? You know, what does it mean to my equipment? How do we need to change those activities that they've been trained on for sometimes 20, 30 years? And so that's a really good consideration to make sure that we move fast enough, but not too fast that we're getting ahead of the social acceptance and making sure that it is safe for the people that are working around it.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I mean, the issue of capacity building, the good thing about new technology is that the first adopters, if you do the right thing, are the best advocates for the industry. So if you're a happy operation manager at the mine, you can go and showcase a piece of technology that they introduce and how it seamlessly integrates with the operation and hopefully even improves it. I think that's really where you want to be. Now, the last two questions, I feel we can play them in a bit different way, because one was about which are the test sites. I think that's actually a perfect question to throw back to the audience, because the uniqueness of this forum is that we actually have a number of miners, and some of them have some activities. So for them to maybe talk about why are they looking at this, and you know, what they feel it's important to their side, I think would be a very good question for the audience and to, you know, as an icebreaker. And then the last one is really about what are the next steps, which I think is a perfect question to wrap the panel. So I think in the interest of time, we'd really like to see whether there's any from the mining industry or technology services provider working on projects who would like to share some ideas around. Well, there's one question. Yeah. Ready to catch?
That was heavy. Okay.
Please introduce yourself. Yeah.
So Michel Caro from Hatch, just to bring some international perspective here. We're in 2019, and six years ago we were focusing on, you know, converting everything to natural gas for trucking, and it's not our idea. There's all kind of vehicles on natural gas, but we're not there yet. And back then, the price of fuel was so high that the notion of moving to compressed natural gas or LNG was really the big topics, and all the vendors were promising to have those trucks working on LNG. Now we're 6 years later, and hydrogen is the buzzword, and because it has the notion of being fully renewable in potential. But think about the challenges are very similar, and it's even more complex because hydrogen, LNG, or liquid hydrogen is colder and so more complicated. The energy density with hydrogen is smaller than natural gas. And so in the roadmap of going to fuel with hydrogen, we already had challenges to move to LNG, and hydrogen is one step further, and it's 100 degrees colder in terms of liquefied hydrogen. So just as a memory past of LNG, we did not make it in terms of trucking, and hydrogen is where we're going. So I thought maybe the panelists may share some thoughts on that, because there's still a roadmap to get there on the hydrogen side.
I'm really glad you raised that, because Australia had a similar program in the early 2000s to convert trucks across to LPG rather than LNG, because the diesel price was very high at the time. And the government had some good learnings out of that, for example, it wasn't enough just to subsidise the truck. You also had to put in the refuelling infrastructure. You had to think about, you know, the capex versus the opex for that. You had to help you kind of had to play a matchmaking role between people who owned fleets and people who had refuelling stations and so on. And that program went really well for a while, and then the diesel price fell. And we just didn't get any more conversions. And so one of the real learnings out of that is, just because something has a high price now, don't assume that it's going to be high forever. You know, when you're working out the economics of these things, you need to do a bit of a, well, what's the worst case? What if the price really does dive right back to a historic low? Does it still work out? Do I still want to do it? So I think that's something that, if we're talking about putting hydrogen into fleets and so on in Australia, there's a lot that we can learn from what happened in gas. And what happened in sort of fleet switchover programs elsewhere, to make sure that it is actually a sustainable change and not a flash in the pan. That's to, you know, say just beyond all of the technical things that you learn as well about, you know, cooling things and storing and so on.
If I can add to that, because I mean, this is our experience in developing some projects in this space, and we found that there's a strong appetite for renewables, okay? We actually found that the biggest currency is actually the opportunity for long-term price certainty. And that only comes because you're actually leveraging renewable resources. So you've got a different incentive mechanism than just the price differential between natural gas and diesel. Like as Michael was saying, you can actually be more the master of your destiny when it comes to your energy and fuel costs. You can actually produce your own, you can create a value chain around your operation where you can do that. I mean, that is what is different. The challenges are technical, no doubt, and will need to be addressed. But I think probably the drivers could be stronger, including the fact that if we decarbonize this type of operations, it's a huge contribution to the planet.
I just going to say, I think in terms of that energy security aspect is really interesting. I don't think the hydrogen price is there yet. So I think, was it you saying this at the roundtable yesterday, or was someone else, about how the magnitude of the fluctuations in fossil fuel prices are, you know, they're an order of magnitude smaller than what the hydrogen price is at the moment. So the amount of protection that you get from that is quite small. It needs the hydrogen price to come down to where it's comparable. But you know, it will get there. It's just we're not there yet.
You know, the trajectory is clear. So, other questions? Need to give the box back at the end.
I mean,
Is there someone ready to catch or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just
Alan from Hydrogenics. So we've been actively involved here for a long time, and the challenge has really been we put in a lot of effort and proposals into Australia. I wanted to know from the panelists, demonstration projects are great in hydrogen, and we're happy to see those. But when do you see Australia breaking out and being a leader in a very large project? And it might not be yours, but it could be where you're seeing the industry, and when it's happening, where there's a very large, substantial project here in Australia that would create the vision. And what I keep saying is, you know, Australia becoming the hydrogen superpower that has the potential to be.
We probably see one of the early parts is in grid firming. So, providing some support for energy markets in taking another storage mechanism. So, utilising that for, say, some power generation assets. Frequency on wind power generation can also mean that we might be putting that through to help support the grid during the day and store that as hydrogen, which then if that becomes at a lower cost, we can then utilise that in other value streams such as mobility or blending and other projects. So I think that might be one of the early ones to move.
Any more comments?
Well, this is something we've been struggling with a lot, with trying to write a national strategy is to go, how do you get out of the demonstration project phase and into commercialisation? And I mean, one thing what I've learned over my career in the public service is that government modelling is almost always wrong. You look back 5 years later and you go, oh, that's hilarious. I thought that was going to happen and it didn't. So I'd be really hesitant to pick a particular winner. But one thing I do think that we've learned out of the renewables industry is that it's really important to get the financing right to make that commercialisation happen. And my feeling is that the way that we are set up at the moment with ARENA as a granting agency, with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation as someone who can provide sort of discount finance, equity, loans, bonds, that sort of stuff, and who also have a remit to draw in private sector finance, because this money is not all going to come from the government, it's way too big. It really needs private sector finance, and a lot of that will be foreign investment. And I think the way that we've set that up across the renewables chain has actually worked really well. So the trick is going to be to make it work for hydrogen. I don't think hydrogen is ready yet for large-scale debt and equity finance. I mean, if someone else has another view on that, I'd be really happy to talk to you because, like I said, the government's always wrong. But at some point, we need to think about that handover and how you start to move the technologies across. I think one of the advantages that renewable hydrogen production has in that space is that it's quite modular, so that it can grow quite organically. It doesn't require you to make a leap from, a megawatt to a gigawatt. You can grow slowly, and that really manages the finance risk, which I think helps a lot.
We have time for one more question, and then we'll do the final wrapping. So we've got Alistair there. Oh, let's do 2 questions here. So please.
Hi, does that work?
Yeah.
My name's Richard Finlay-Jones from Pilbara Solar, and really enjoyed the presentation. Thanks very much. I guess my call is an invitation to deal with the issue of social licence in the traditional owners. Pilbara Solar is 25% owned by the Amity Marlborough Aboriginal Corporation, so we'd like to throw it out there to say, hey, come and talk to our guys. And we've got the land and we've got the passion.
I think that's a really good point, that the hydrogen industry has a lot it can learn from the mining sector as well. The mining sector has really put a lot of effort into community acceptance, into working with Indigenous organisations, in dealing with land tenure issues. I think that I've heard that's particularly an issue here in WA, because you've got lots of overlapping types of land tenure. As the hydrogen industry grows, it's got a lot that it can learn from you guys, so please do share that to help it grow.
You have a question from Alistair?
Hi, thank you. Alistair Dick from the Rocky Mountain Institute. It's sort of a two-part question. I love the idea of collaboration. And the question, I think, is, as we grow in knowledge sharing, are minds prepared to be less, what's the word to use, holding tight onto their IP so that it can be sort of more shared, in the sense that, you know, electrons are really not a competitive advantage as far as maybe processes are concerned. And the thought of, you know, what does multi-level collaboration look like, so we can springboard, you know, hydrogen into renewables, into process, into multi-dimensional aspects. That's something that's very interesting for me. And how does the mining, you know, do you have test sites that you'd be willing to make available, Catherine, like you were saying, where these kind of test benches can be set up for this cross-collaboration?
I think that question was directed to me. So firstly, I think your question around are mining companies willing to be more open to collaborate. I have seen that in my time. I've been in BHP for just under 12 years, and I would say very early in my career that was definitely the case, where it was we are BHP and we don't work as well with other people. Perhaps we're very protective of our IP. But I have seen a transition in BHP, and I've also seen a transition in other mining and resource companies who I've spoken to, who are looking to be progressive, to collaborate. I think, as the Minister pointed out earlier, the reason why we as BHP and other companies are looking to transition to zero emissions is because of climate change. We realise it's real and we need to do something, and I think the solution in many cases is we need to work collaboratively to share knowledge, as my colleague mentioned earlier, and also to provide those test benches where we take a couple of different potential solutions and actually collaboratively test them on different mine sites. And it has to be throughout the whole value chain. So we need people who are doing work in the production, storage, transport and use elements, all working together.
I might say as well, I think there's a good opportunity for collaboration around infrastructure. One of the pieces of feedback we've had as we go around the country talking to people about national hydrogen strategies, they say don't do what the LNG industry did in Gladstone, where they put in 3 LNG trains next to each other, and each one's got its own road and its own pipeline and its own electrical substation. And it was an incredibly inefficient infrastructure build because they all wanted to be first to market, and what's happened is they all ended up eating each other's lunch. So I think there's some really good opportunities, particularly in an industry that's going fast, is to think about, okay, where does it make sense to collaborate on things that aren't necessarily IP, but are infrastructure that if we build it, we all benefit.
Yeah, I think one of the fundamental parts of our project down at Jandakot is simply setting up that test bed. We've showcased the facility as a gas technology hub, so we've got reciprocating engines, gas-powered air conditioning, but now we're moving into, we've got hydrogen availability through turbines, and working with other partners to come down and do some of the testing, and also working with university to provide sponsored partnerships and PhD opportunities to come and do research papers that helps the whole industry. So I think really setting up that test bed is a great opportunity for all of us in the room.
Personal experience, my PhD advisor in Italy was the inventor of the diesel common rail engine and a patent attorney. I worked with him 2 years reviewing patents, and he had this one comment, which is IP is only ever valuable if you get to use it. So locking away IP that then nobody uses, yes, is a market defense mechanism, but it is a waste of knowledge. I think it's important to work ways to do that. Now, I said that I had one last question I kept aside to close the panel, and really is, what do you see are the next steps for Australian resource sector to implement hydrogen activities and real projects? Please.
I think what we're doing now, collaboration is key, and that's first and foremost important, I think, just to be able to ensure that we do have that knowledge sharing, that we are collaborating, and where there are synergies, that we're taking advantage of those. The next, I guess, order of priority for us is really to stay plugged in to the sector, plugged in to not only the users and the manufacturers of this new, that are going to be important in this industry, but also government and also the community as well, and workers who will also be impacted by this change, to ensure that the standards are ready for industry to use. So those are definitely key for me.
Alison?
I think the one I would choose would be to see more demonstration and pilot projects, for all that I just said about how we need to get out of the demonstration phase, but we need to get into the demonstration phase first. Yeah, and I think because there's a lot of things that, you know, just that learning by doing is incredibly powerful. It's really good for skills, it's really good for standards, it's good for safe work practices. As government, this is often how we find out about regulatory barriers, is because someone does something and bumps up against it. You know, I can't put my whole team onto just going through every statute book in the country and trying to figure out all of the possible ways that every single law we've got could impact hydrogen, because that would take us 10 years. You know, it's really people doing projects that helps us find where there are things that need to be tweaked or changed, or where the lack of legislation or lack of regulation is acting as a barrier. So for me, it's that learning by doing actually would help everything go faster.
Yes, I'd absolutely agree. Demonstration pilots, I think, are critical to enable the regulations, and also, you know, to further progress the safety requirements as well.
I think some of it is ride the momentum that is at the moment. You know, it's incredible and a great opportunity for us all to get together in this sort of forum and discuss hydrogen and the opportunities. So I think that's the point where we work through some of the project and the modelling and reach a point where we think we've hit a brick wall. You know, there's always a will, there's a way, there's somebody in the industry that has a need or an issue to be resolved, and that often is the point that can make the numbers go round. So don't give up.
Well, thank you, everybody, and join me in thanking our panelists for today. I'll bring us coming to give us a bit of housekeeping, really well, 10 minutes before coffee break. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Attilio, and I apologize because I failed to formally introduce you at the beginning, but Attilio wears two hats as the president of the Australian Hydrogen Association and the CEO of H2U, which is developing the green hydrogen project in Port Lincoln in southern Australia. So we've caught up on time a bit, so I'm going to suggest that we start again at 11:05. So please go out and grab a coffee. Thank you.